here at Symbols 8, and we're trying to appreciate and to understand something that is enormously difficult to come to, and it has been a difficulty, especially for all of the phases of Western civilization. We're going to look at a couple of snags that caught the entire Western world for 2,000 years. There were occasionally people who were able to go around it, or to even pole vault over it. And occasionally there were those who just refused to deal with it. But the first time that it was effectively challenged was only about 300 years ago. And it was effectively challenged in such a mathematical way that there weren't but a handful of people for the first 100 years who really understood it, and then all of a sudden it seemed to sink in, and that's when you had the sudden age of revolutions, when it sank in. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, all of these came as sort of like a delayed reaction, and the delayed reaction was against the formal structure of considering that the mind is the arbiter of everything, and that the balanced structure of the mind means that everything is okay. Everything is as it should be. And this is a very unfortunate quality. It's like going midway. It's like saying of someone, well, you have matured to the point to where you're rich, independent, and only 40, and that is how you should be. But the unfortunate thing is that you live longer, you begin to age, circumstance sometimes works against you, you can lose wealth, one certainly loses one's physical tone, and one becomes old and realizes that 40 was just the midpoint. And so if everything is set up to attain that apex at the midpoint and everything else is dismissible, then you have a problem. Because very few people then occupy that apex. Most people are young, trying to come up, or not so handsome, or not so pretty, or not so wealthy. And that if you go too far over from that, well, now you're too old. You're no longer current. You're no longer at the apex. And so a mental ideal comes to tyrannize human life. For the best of all reasons, it's the ideal. So the difficulty with this is when we're looking in our maturation, we're trying to understand how it is that a real learning pulls experience through the mind into another flow. And that other flow is consciousness, conscious vision. To pull the mythic horizon of feelings and images, oral language, to pull all of that, one's character, to pull all of that so it comes all the way through the mind, has the form given it by the mind, but that the form is not grasping, it's not clamping. It's a form that is able to be transparent and become like a window or a doorway, as one would more rightly say, and that it's fine to go through that doorway. The phase approach that I've developed gets not only around a lot of the snags and issues and doesn't just jump over them, but takes them on specifically. Each time a phase comes into play, it literally combs through these problems that have been exacerbated. Especially the culprits are the classical Greeks, culprits in a sense because they represented an apex, an ideal. And they were the first to attain that ideal and to be able to express it discursively in very refined language, very refined written language, so it survived. And almost all of the groups in the Western world looked to use this successful tool, the successful model, and they vied with each other to be the successors to the Greeks. And not only were different kingdoms successors as far as India and the Mideast, down into Africa, and all over the European model, but the Romans also figured that they were the inheritors of the whole thing, and so they unassumingly, literally gulped down Greek civilization, Greek culture, and made it their own without really thinking about it. And one doesn't find but only a handful of Romans who became aware that they were in a very serious situation. And then, of course, when the Roman Greek-based civilization hit the fan in the early 1st century AD, it was like a massacre of civilization that ended up with one of the all-time great nightmare travesties, larger than 9/11. The Roman Emperor Nero went psychotic, and he burned the whole city of Rome down. Rome at that time had about 2 million people. It was a catastrophe. And he burned it down because he wanted to build a perfect city. And this was all inherited from hodgepodge of people who were not God like he was. And within a year of burning Rome down, the successors to Nero laid siege to Jerusalem and eventually dismantled Jerusalem, burnt it down as well, because it was seen as a threat. It was seen as a threat to the new Rome, because the understanding was that the Greek ideal had come out of not Greece, but originally had come out of the Near East, had come out of that coast of the Eastern Mediterranean that had Phoenicia, had Canaan, had Palestine, had parts of Egypt, had parts of Syria, parts of Lebanon, that the original Greek culture came out of that Mid-East, that Near East, and that Jerusalem was like Rome. It was the inheritor of a whole long tradition that predated the Greeks. We know now that the classical Greek language that was used at its apex had 1,000 years before an earlier form called Linear B that was deciphered only about 50 years ago, not by a philosopher, but by an architect, Michael Ventris, finally figured out the code and how to decipher Linear B. And one could see this is archaic Greek going back to about 1600 BC. What is not deciphered so far is an earlier form of Greek than Linear B called Linear A, and no one has been able to decipher that because it goes back almost 1,000 years before that. and is cognate with the kind of language that also is not readable, not decipherable, that occurs in ancient India, in the Indus Valley civilization. And that goes back to about 2700 BC. Two huge cities, about 500,000 each, nearly 5,000 years ago, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. And no one can read the symbols of their language. One can see the roots of enormously important things, but no one knows how to read that. There is a pictograph in that ancient India of this yogi sitting with big horns on his head, and obviously it's almost like a primordial shaman who has discovered not just trance but yoga, because he's sitting in a very classic hatha yoga position already 5,000 years ago. Another shows a great huge Brahma bull with a self symbol in front of it, a wheel with some geometric spokes in it. But no one knows how to read these languages. No one knows how to read these symbols, and so the meaning is not there. Symbols need to be read, and this is a difficulty. Symbols cannot talk to us. We have to read them. And part of the difficulty is that when you read silently, all of the normal, natural curbs on form that are there ritually forever in just the way that beings live in groups and interchange, they're not operative. The silent mind reading symbols is a great danger because it relies on its own form, its own abstract procedures, and not on the rituals of life, not on the rituals that give us experience. And so there comes a self-contained, formal, abstract procedure of the mind. Not yet logic, but classically in Plato one finds four different levels, four different qualities that the mind is able to discern, but that natural experience doesn't discern. And the four are divided into a pair, and there's like a higher and lower of those two pairs, and one pair is lower and the other pair is higher, but each one has a development in it. And Plato says that the very first level that the mind can distinguish, the Greek word for it is eikasia. It is just the apprehension of images, the seeing of images. In Greek, images, we would use the term icon, ikonos in Greek. One sees images and responds to them. But the response is that these images are not all that easy to group together, and sometimes they're images that are reflections, like looking into water, or like seeing different aspects of images, or sometimes they're just shadows. The images are silhouettes, cutouts. So the level in the mind of eikasia has to be tightened up, and when it's tightened up, it becomes, Plato says, he uses the Greek term for it, pistis, firm belief. In eikasia, when you're just looking at the images, it's kind of like a loose way, but with pistis, everything is brought not logically together, not in the mind, but ritually brought together so that one now has a belief that is firm and unshakable. And those who share that belief make like a phalanx of people together, and of course, right away, there's a them and an us. There are those that don't have the pistis. There are those who are still wondering about the images, and so we have to set them right. We have to make doctrines. We have to make laws, codes, schools, religions, all kinds of social institutions, political things, in order that they get it, that this is the way to get a firm belief. And Plato says of these two states that all of a sudden there's a deepening in the mind where the symbols that have loosely grouped the images and then have tightly bound the belief, undergo a process of metamorphosis in the mind when a new technique is brought into play, and the technique is, he calls it dianoia. It means reasoning higher. That one can learn that the symbolic mind is refinable by a procedure of reasoning, of comparing, of contrasting, of pro and con argument that is controlled so that there are stages of it, the presentation of evidence, pro and con, the comparing, the reasoning of the whole thing. And so Plato says that this dianoia is a new technique, and that the mind learns that it may have to modify its belief. It may have to have a different version of pistis. We're going to have maybe pistis 6.3. We've gone through several phases, and now we have not only just a firm belief, but it's been refined by reasoning, by this dianoia. And then he says there is a amazing fourth stage, and he calls it noesis. That occasionally there is a moment of truth. That all of a sudden you have a direct intuitional realization in a moment, and you know that this is eternally true. This is always true. It isn't just from refinement. It isn't because of your belief. It isn't because of the images. It's because of itself. One of the classic cases in the early 20th century was Einstein. Albert Einstein, when he was younger, he struggled with various things. He was stateless for 5 years, and finally, the only place he could get a job was in the Swiss Patent Office. He was a third-class clerk in the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. But he was deepening and deepening and deepening. And he was like a mathematical genius. And he was wondering about magnetic fields and the math of magnetic fields. And he was thinking of magnetic fields in space, in the ether. And then he was thinking of magnetic fields in gravity. And all of a sudden he had a moment of noesis. He almost fell off his chair. He was in the patent office. And he realized that if you fell off the roof of a building and kept falling, you would not feel gravity. You would be in free fall. And it was at the same time not only free fall, but rest at rest. And that reality has, behind the play of images, behind the play of belief, behind the play of mental structures that have been reasoned out, there is an eternal quality which at the same time, it is paradoxical. It is continuous motion and at the same time perfect rest. And out of this came the special theory of relativity. he realized that if this is true, then time and space, no matter what it's doing, making images, making beliefs, making symbol structures in the mind, that beyond that, reality is perfectly at rest and in constant continuous motion. So that if the eternal reality is both in perfect rest and constant motion, then movement in the world is a different kind, a different class. That there are two different kinds of motion. One motion is an eternal continuous motion that has no beginning and no end, and so is at the same time at rest at any given point in it. And this was the classic Greek word, dynamis. It was dynamic, but it had the ability at any given point to achieve an energized stability. And so reality can at any moment achieve a form that's stable, but its stability is not because it is a thing, but because it's energy that has been balanced in its polarity. And when it's balanced in its polarity, its motion becomes now movement that includes opposites for any movement. And so you get first law of thermodynamics: for every movement there's an equal and opposite reaction. One of Newton's first realizations. And he got it from a moment of noesis himself. He was, Newton as a young man was always sickly, and there were different times when he would just have to go back to the home where he was raised. He was adopted in Woolthorpe, England. And he was like Einstein. He was a mathematical genius, but he was not well. And he was sitting out under an apple tree and saw an apple fall and realized that this means that one can understand the entire universe by showing that it isn't just that this is a movement, but that it is a movement within an order that has its gearedness. And so out of Newton came the mechanical universe, but out of Einstein came the relative cosmos. The cosmos of relativity. And because of his genius, Einstein even came to understand that space itself must be a form existentially and capable of movement, so that under extraordinary conditions in a gravitational field, there will be such a thing as the frame of space itself dragging, because the energy is faster than the frame of space can move. The dynamis will slightly exceed the kinesis. And we know now that Einstein was right. Just a couple of years ago, early in the 21st century, the first evidences of frame dragging of space was found around black holes and the neutron stars. Neutron stars are so powerful in their gravity that their magnetic fields lay like tattoos on their surface. And black holes go even further. All of this is that these are moments where the mind exceeds its symbolic capacity to form and goes into another flow. And that other flow is called insight. But it is a moment of insight. And that our kind, men and women like us, for a very long time, longer than civilizations have been around, have found found that one can go into those moments of insight, into those instances of noesis, and be absorbed in them and remain in them. And these are called mystical states. Mystical states. So that the mind has a mysteriousness outside of the bounds of its formal capacity to structure. So that the wise thing, the saying used to be, don't tie knots, tie bows, because you may have to untie them later. Don't carry your learning around cinched in firm beliefs that you are not going to change, and anybody who doesn't agree is immature or stupid or bad or needing to be punished, or especially just being ignorable. This entire quality comes into play again and again over the last several thousand years, and one finds people making the kind of educated, reasoned statements upon which they then found a lot of fame and a lot of activity, and which the natural person would say, this sounds fishy, and the mystic would say, you're going to hit the wall with this kind of belief. One of them is here in Suzanne Langer's The Practice of Philosophy, her first book, 1930, with a prefatory note by her teacher Alfred North Whitehead from Harvard. The Practice of Philosophy, Understanding and Truth. And she says here on page 135, how then can a symbolic pattern be said to present the form of any real thing or event? The answer is there is no such thing as the form of a real thing or of an event. There is no such thing as pure experience. Just as all thought must have some logical constants, though these may be variously chosen, so all experience must have some specific pattern wherein it may be sensed that there are many patterns possible within the same reality. All experience of sense or thought is selective, and it must formulate. There's something fishy about that. And yet, it has the conviction of, at that time, about 2,400 years of reasoned Western thought, going all the way back to Aristotle. And yet, her teacher, not only Alfred North Whitehead, but her prize philosopher that she was reading, and we talked about last week, Wittgenstein. That Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico Philosophicus that we talked a little bit about last week, and Whitehead's Symbolism, Its Meaning and Effect, a little tiny book, she says, though they come from completely opposite camps, in fact, Whitehead and Wittgenstein really didn't care for each other. But she says both their books come to the same conclusion. Logic is the only structure by which the mind can be kept formed. And yet, when one comes to symbolic logic, there are limits beyond which there is no longer a language that is possible. Well, this is exactly the situation that Plato dealt with already 2,400 years ago. And one has to understand, Plato was the teacher of Aristotle for 20 years. But Aristotle didn't get what Plato was doing. One of the few things that has survived from Plato, other than his dialogues, are a couple of letters. And the most famous one is Plato's 7th letter. And he wrote this 7th letter to a king in Sicily. He had gone there by invitation of this king's father and tried to set up a rational kingdom in Syracuse, the big city in Sicily. All the complications of the political scene devolved so that Plato could never quite get it together, and so he left, went back to Athens, founded his school called the Academy, the very first academy. And then the vicissitudes, the son came into power militarily and sent for Plato again 20 years later. Come in, now we can set something up. And when Plato got there, he realized that the son indeed liked tinkering with thought, liked tinkering with symbols and philosophy, and had become confused. And so he was trying to set the son straight. It didn't work. More political involvements, and finally he was sent for a third time, and reluctantly the old Plato went back and gave it one more shot. Of course it didn't work. Didn't work at all. So he wrote a letter, the seventh letter. And he says in the seventh letter that it is impossible for anyone to write down what it is that I'm concerned with. You can neither say it nor can you write it, because language in those two forms cannot convey it. Because what is being conveyed is noetic rather than a pistis based on icons, on images. He says in the letter, here's a quotation. Those who claim to know the subjects I study seriously, whether as hearers of mine or other teachers, or from their own discoveries, they cannot possibly understand the matter at issue. There does not exist, nor will there ever exist, any treatise of mine dealing therewith, for it does not at all admit of verbal expression like other studies. But as a result of continued application to the subject itself, communion therewith, it is brought to birth in the psyche, all of a sudden, as a light that is kindled by a leaping spark, and thereafter it will nourish itself. What it is that is communicated is not an is, because it's important, and this is where our phase education comes in. A process does not have things. It doesn't have elements, doesn't have parts, doesn't have particles. It'll have waves, it'll have resonances, it'll have flows, but no things. But in order for the mind, symbolically, to be sure in its reasoning to bring its dianoia back into a refined pistis, so we really now understand what it is that we believe and why, has to have every single particle be a thing, including not only things, but all the relations between things now have to become things as well. So that you get a symbolic logic where all the relationalities are signs just like the elements are signs, and so everything is put into this structure where you have to be able to read everything that is there. It isn't just E equals MC squared, it's the E, which is the thing, the equals, which is a thing, the M, which is a thing, the C, which is a thing, the squared, which is a thing. I'll let the symbolic mind then reads that bit by bit and puts it together, strings it together in terms of the conception, in terms of the idea. Two deep elements do not participate in that abstraction One is the imagination, and the second is the individuality. Because not only is there a character, one has one's character and experience. Even animals have character. Plants have character. But when it gets into the symbolic mind, the character achieves the form of an individual. The I-ness. Me. This is me. This is how I am. That's my character for sure, but this is how I am. This is my interpretation of my character and my forming of it. So the imagination and the individuality are not brought into play. And there is a reductiveness of a new capacity that comes into the mind, and it is a process capacity, and the process capacity comes from conscious vision. And that capacity is memory. So that when it comes into the mind in its symbolic structuring assigns it a form as the memory. And what it is supposed to do, it is supposed to memorize the images in their assigned orders so it can recall it. And so you get something like computer memory, which essentially is very fast and very vast, but always is a binary duality bit. And so it isn't really memory, it is just a very fast memorizing. And so roteness, that is, the largest order is called somebody has a good memory, when it isn't memory at all. And Plato says specifically, memory, when it happens, carries a conscious function that one is in the process of remembering, and one can remember not only other things, but one remembers that one is in a noetic flow. And in that noetic flow, the eternal dynamis is operating in you. And that eternal dynamis reveals to you immediately in direct knowing that is superior to reasoning, superior to belief, superior to just looking at the icons, the images. And what makes it superior is not that it's like in a pecking order, but that it is able to bring a whole array of infinite possibilities into play, and also to have the quietness of perfection at the same time. One of the most sophisticated of all yogas was the yoga of this that was done about 1800, 1700 years ago in India by a man named Patanjali. It's called the Yoga Sutras. And when we come to our interval of symbols, we'll have a special lecture. I guess I understand it's going to be New Year's Day or something like that, on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, where the mind is not only refined to the ultimate logic, but the logic is brought so that its form of reference comes into a secret kind of a transform where it goes back out into a completely resonant harmonic rather than form. And Patanjali will say, one of the great statements in world history, in this state, if someone performs, the Sanskrit is, the word used is pranama. If one applies pranama in that state, whatever is said will be. It will come into existence. It'll be the creative word. Let's take a little break. We're going to come next week to a new pair, and we're going to use two of the great symbolists. We're going to use W.B. Yeats and we're going to use William Blake. But for Blake, we're going to use his illustrations to the book of Job. And for Yeats, we're not going to use his poetry, but we're going to use an esoteric occult book that he made out of automatic writing by his wife. And he believed so much that automatic channeled writing must come from some kind of a super coherent source, and that it was only scrambled to us because our minds were scrambled. Our minds were scrambled in that it diced things up logically and in order, and he felt confident that he could free his mind from all of the traditional symbols and of its structure and let his mind go wild. And in its wildness, because he was a poet, he would be able to reconstitute out of the wildness what esoteric hidden order there was, and he did that. And towards the end of his life, he came out with this book called A Vision. And he was startled to find that out of the suitcase full of automatic scribbling of his wife, she did it for month after month after month. When he brought it together, he realized that all his life he had been writing poems about aspects of this, and that there was a character reoccurring in poems over a period of like 30 years who was the spirit that had channeled all this automatic writing to his wife. She didn't know his work, because a lot of it at that time was just not available. So we're going to see some mysterious things. I want to bring us back before Plato and Aristotle. There were two poets in classical Greece that were torrential. One of them is Pindar, and the other was Sappho. And I want to give you just a little bit of Sappho so that you can hear someone who was able to bring their experience to such a high power that it exceeded the energy of the structure of the mind to corral it and to stop it. And she plunged into a whole new realm of vision. This is it. This is fragment 31 from Sappho, in the translation by Alexander Nemas and Paul Woodruff. How like a god I feel he is, this man, when he sits close, facing you, hearing your sweet voice and seductive laughter. It jolts my heart into a flutter in my breast. One look at you, voice gives out completely. Tongue turns to splinters. A gentle burst of flame runs under the skin. Eyes don't see a thing. Ears whirl and rumble. Sweat pours down me. I shake all over. I go pale as green grass, that I'm close to being dead, or so I feel to myself, but all this I must endure. Torrential. One of the qualities of vision, as we will see, is that when it is forbidden or when it is hidden, when it's been corralled for a long time, when a moment of insight comes, it's either too fast to really note, or it's too torrential and doesn't stop. It's like a broken fire hydrant. So that one of the problems of the symbolic mind is not to refine it into stopping the flow of experience until it can be parceled out neatly and nicely. And also to extend the quality of the attentiveness of the mind so that it can follow not only experience in its natural flow, but can follow consciousness in its particular mode and its flow. And the difference between consciousness and experience is that they flow in different ways, almost as if it were in different directions, so that the expectation of the mind is that if it lets those two flows going in different directions just be pure and natural, they're going to like swirl into a whirlwind. And we'll see in William Blake, his illustrations of Job, he shows that Job's experience of God is that God is just a voice out of the whirlwind. And Blake shows that Job can hear God, but he can't allow himself to see, because he is terrified that what he will see is the whirlwind, and that's all that there will be. And so he is scared. He's not afraid like a man would be afraid. He's not puzzled like a man would be puzzled, but he's terrified because this is more titanic than his being can hold, can take. Plato says, distinct from Aristotle, the reason that the mind cannot read symbols is because symbols bring things together in that kind of formal ordering. But the flow from beyond doesn't stay in those forms at all. And so the mind learns to cut them off before they get too powerful, to filter. And so minds become very, very good at filtering any energy, any dynamics that's beyond it. And in order to gain confidence that it's doing the right thing, it commandeers the flow of experience, of feeling, and of images by making sure that the rituals accord with the symbols. That the steps of action that one does in the world add up to sequences that give a real objective purpose that one can see. And one can see the steps and one can see the result. And that the mind is corresponding to this in a referential way so that it has limited number of steps which it can see, and then results, conclusions. And that this process in the mind is the logical steps of argument. And that one learns that one has to follow this, and that there's methods that can be learned to follow this. And he says of all of this that it is a rhetorical form that can be imposed. But Plato says of himself that he writes not in a rhetoric, but in a poetic. It's a different kind of language. That a poetic is a language that delivers a form called art. And that one has to be a lover of wisdom. Not just after understanding, but like Sappho, passionate about getting oneself into that flow where it seems initially as if one is going to die. That this is a high state of the lover of wisdom, and what comes out of that is the person who is an art form. And so that philosophy, when it's really done passionately in this way, is an art. It's not at all in the mind. It's not at all a form which the individual owns and assents to and believes and can be very clear about it and reasons, but it's like an artist who has created an art form in the way that we're talking about it here, that wasn't talked about in the classical origins of it. The poets would write it, like Sappho or Pindar, or the poets like Aeschylus or Sophocles or Euripides. And there are times in Plato where his art overcomes by far his ability to be clear as a thinker, and he delivers something which is unbelievably beautiful in the sense that he has revealed to us the way in which these scintillating forms of realization come out, and they're stable in a different way from ritual forms and symbol forms. And that if you bring the quality of these living art forms into play, they come into play in two distinct ways at the same time. One of the high marks in ancient wisdom was the effect of something like frankincense, which is why it was equal to gold or myrrh. Frankincense, when you first smell it, when you get that scent, it activates two different aspects of yourself at the same time. It activates the natural body response to it, but it also activates the mind at the same time, both of them together. And in ancient Egyptian wisdom, it was always a high art of perfume making, because perfumes were the way incense. Sacred incense was the quickest way to awaken someone to the visionary quality beyond what the mind or the body could contain, and yet show you're not going to ruin yourself. The body will not die, the mind will not go mad. And so the ancient Egyptian perfume incense makers made a critical, analytical survey of the effects of all these, and they came up with another incense called kyphe in Greek. It had 16 ingredients, and those all together had the similar effect to frankincense. Myrrh also has that effect, but it has it in a little bit different registration. When memory comes into play in the mind, consciousness also is able to come into play in nature in such a way that nature now is magical. Instead of nature just being natural and mysterious, it is now magical as well. It has a special scintillating quality to it. And because one has perhaps never seen this, never experienced this before, in fact, the seeing of it and the experiencing of it is in a completely different mode, and so one doesn't even know how to relate. And Plato, in his big dialogue called The Republic, gives us a myth of the cave, Book 10 of The Republic, which is the classic way of describing it. He says in that myth that most of life is as if we were sitting deep in an underground cave, and that we're all arranged on these rows of benches, and that we are chained to these benches. And behind us, there's an enormous fire and figures that are like cutouts throw their shadows against the wall of the cave where we are all looking. And we think that those who can identify the most shapes quickest are the most intelligent, and so forth. He says this entire scenario is manufactured. It's an artifact of the way in which we are misconditioned by civilization. And that the thing to do is to realize that we don't have to stay chained. We don't have to stay looking at the shadows on the wall, but that we can turn around and see who's making these shadows. And the Greek word of that turning around is metanoia. It's not just noetic, but it is even further beyond noesis. It's a metanoia. And he says, this metanoia, while noesis will lead to art, the metanoia will lead to science. Will lead to us understanding for the first time how reality works. Not just how we work when our spirits are artistically brought into play, but how it is that reality, that the cosmos itself works and really is. But as we said earlier, before the break, Plato was aware that there is an eternal motion that is continuous, it never stops, so that it paradoxically has also the quality of perfect rest. And that someone who offers this perfect rest will at the same time be offering motion without end, like a free fall where one is never falling because it's just an eternal motion. But that in the limited world of things and of thoughts, there is only movement, not this eternal motion. Not the dynamis, but there's only a kinetic movement that's going on. He says, there are a few people who, when they turn around, they see that there are only these creatures holding up cutouts. They realize that they're in a limited cave. And they find their way back out. And when they come out into daylight, because they have never seen the sun, they're absolutely blinded by it. And they think this is horrible because there's just nothing but this flash of searing heat and light. And they go back and quietly sit down and drape the chains over them, and they stay. There's a beautiful presentation in a science fiction film of this called Logan's Run with Michael York that was made a number of years ago, where they have been brought up for several generations, a couple hundred years, in huge domes, and they have never been outside. They don't know what nature is. To them, life happens in these huge domes, that's it. And because of circumstance, he finally, with one of the ladies, under threat of being killed, you only can live to be 30. And you have these little markers on your hand. And when they blink red, that means that you've got to voluntarily take your chances in a thing called carousel, and that if you can swim up through the anti-gravity of the carousel, you'll be saved. Of course, no one ever is, and everyone dies at age 30. He and his lady friend managed to go through a series of adventures, and they find themselves coming out of the dome for the first time, and there's a sunrise. And they say to each other, "What is it? It feels warm." And he says, "I don't know. I've never seen it. No one has ever told me." Plato says that reality is like this when we first come upon it. And this is why philosophy has an important function, because it can prepare us to stay with it long enough to acclimate to it so that we begin to understand what it really is and how things really are. Because he says the only way in which a lover of wisdom comes to their beloved is through a constant continuity of application. That there's something, everyone has a little bit different timing, but it's the constancy, it's the yoga, of the contact with the yearning, not just to know, but the yearning to be opened up and the courage to let oneself be opened up so that both the body and the mind open together. And out of that comes an exchange like lovers exchanging. An ecstasis, but an ecstasis which is not just of the body temporarily or of the mind in a realization, but because it has emerged out of the continuousness, it is a form that stays continuous. But its continuousness is not as an integral shape, but as a differential fan of possibilities that constantly form and reform, and that it is a scintillating form like a jewel. Like a jewel. And we talked a couple of weeks ago of Plato's other myth in the Phaedrus of the chariot, the charioteer. And that myth of the charioteer is also in India, in the Katha Upanishad, the very same figure. That the individual in the symbolic mind is like somebody who's the charioteer, but the emotional matrices that are the horses pulling this chariot are directly opposites. Jekyll and Hyde. One of them is purely noble and loves order, but the other one purely loves disorder. Doesn't see any nobility in that at all. So that one has wildness and nobility hooked to the same vehicle. And so the charioteer has to be enormously adept at handling this, and very few people are. And one of the secrets of the way in which one can handle this is to rapidly alternate. Because if you alternate very rapidly, for a picosecond, the wild one can go this way, and the next picosecond, the noble one can go this way, and they go together because there's a synergy. And what it comes out of that then is something that the symbolic mind, when it realizes that it's able to do this, it comes to a realization that there is not just movement in the world, but there's such a thing as a confluence of forces that make a vector. And that if you can hold that vector constant, then the opposites are in balance whether they seem like it or not, because the vector will show you in its continuity, and its continuity is not to make a straight line. Its continuity is to curve in a regular way. Because reality doesn't like to have straight lines and planes. It likes, because of its spiral quality, it likes curves that are not only regular, but they have a certain quality to them. That the longer you stay with that curve, the more it opens out. And that this constantly opening out spiral, in fact, happens in nature in the chambered nautilus shell. And that this is a universal index to differential order. And that all of the Pythagorean harmonics can be charted against a spiral that steadily, constantly opens at a regular increment. And that when one gets that balance in one's form, what occurs is something stupendous, that the spiritual person recognizes that they are of the same kind of jeweled form that the cosmos is. They're not just a glint of the cosmos, but they're the entire cosmos in miniature. They have every aspect of reality now in them. And so what happens is that the arts and sciences are brought not in alignment, but they're brought into resonance. So that the correspondences now are not on the basis of representation, but on the basis of the presenting of the harmonic. And so one now begins to become calibrated musically rather than just linearly. Not just in geometry, but in a whole different mathematic. And that while the art forms are able to have their differential possibilities explored by criticality, by critiques. You can improve art by critiques. Sciences are improved by analytics. And that critiques and analytics have a resonant way of relating to each other so that one can become, at the same time, more and more refined as a person and more able to understand the analytic of the cosmos at the very same time. And at this point then, Plato says in the Phaedrus, what would stop us from doing this if we know that this is possible? And he says, in the Phaedrus, Socrates has a place where he and Phaedrus have been talking for a long time about love. And they're outside the city. They're along the Lysis River bank. It's hot, it's noon, it's midday in the heat, and in the heat, cicadas in the trees along the banks begin to sing. And Socrates says, at this particular poetic moment in the dialogue in the Phaedrus, he says to Phaedrus, now we're being reminded of something here by reality. That you know about cicadas, don't you? And Phaedrus says, well, why don't you remind me? And Socrates says, well, I have to tell you a myth. Not because it is mythic, but the only way in which I can convey this to you is to create the circumstance wherein you can have the insight yourself. And I will create the mythos of it, but you have to occupy the poetic insight yourself. So set yourself to do this. And in order to do this, you will have to realize that the myth that I'm telling you about the cicadas is actually happening to you right now. And the point of the myth will be the point of your doing it right then, so that they both have to occur together. And if they occur together, you will have established a point on that spiral, which is the true vector of the real. And so Socrates tells him the myth. He says, before the Muses were born, human beings were of a certain kind, and they just all the time were immersed in singing. That's what they did all the time. We'll see in Blake's Illustrations to Job, the very first one, he says there was a state before man came when all the morning stars sang together. Socrates is saying there was a state of humanity before we became like we are now, where we were cicadas, always singing. And the Muses, when they were first appeared, the cicadas were surprised that there were such things as muses. Especially two muses. The first, the oldest one, was Calliope, the fair one. And the other was Urania, the muse of the heavenly expanses. And so the Muses were so impressed by the cicadas that he says in the dialogue, it's quite wrong for a devotee of the Muses not to have heard about this. It is said these cicadas were once men in the days before the Muses were born. When the Muses were born and singing had been invented, the story goes that some of the men of that time were ecstatic with pleasure and were so busy singing they didn't bother with food and drink, so that before they knew it, they had lived their lives and were dead. They were the origin of the race of cicadas, whom the Muses granted the gift of never needing any food once they were born. All they do is sing from the moment of their births until their deaths without eating or drinking. After dying, they go to the Muses and they tell them which men here on earth honored them. They tell Terpsichore, the muse of dance, the names of those who have honored her with making dances. They tell Erato, the muse of erotic love, who has honored her. And so on for all the Muses according to each one's area of responsibility. So that the cicadas report which people have made things in honor of what the Muses present in a differential way. And there are 9 Muses. There are 9 areas. There's history, there's poetry, there's epic, all the arts, dance, mime, science, the heavens, astronomy. So that the entire differential ecology is presented by 9 women, Muses, who are not goddesses. They are higher than goddesses, because they present the conscious qualities along with the natural integrals. And so all the arts and sciences are in the array of the 9 Muses. And he says, now, Phaedrus, all of our talking up to this point has been on level of trying to work within the mind. Now, since the cicadas have begun singing, and they can look down on us and see us, we need to be truthful. We need to do no more speculating, no more just reasoning. Now we must give ourselves over and tell each other exactly the truth, so that they will report of us that we engaged in the art of philosophy, not in the rhetorical exercise of just argument, and certainly not just limiting ourselves to some ritual comportment because we've learned that this is an effective way to do it, of using language to argue in a law court, such and so, of using language to convince others of certain points which we now can prove by evidences, that now we have to shift to a poetic, and that philosophy is the word in Greek is a poiesis. It's a creative making, that as we speak it creatively, so that whatever is being said will have that scintillating quality of actuality, not just in nature, but in bringing the beyond into nature and into our minds at the same time, the two at the same time, like the effect of sacred incense. That nature and the mind undergo a mutual, simultaneous alchemy, so that now the mysterious magicality of nature is immediately apparent in the conscious memory of the mind. And that the mind now, in that state, because it is affine with magical nature, wherever it looks, wherever it thinks, whatever it does, that will be real. Not because It is real because you make it real. It's real because you are now tuned on whatever it is that occurs in this way. It comes from the real. It comes from the motion that never stops, from before any beginning. About 90 AD, and we'll use it when we get to vision in January. The art of the Platonic dialogue was raised to nth degree. Some 400, almost 500 years after Plato, in the Hermetic dialogues, written in Alexandria. And so poetic that the language that they use is a Greek that is so far beyond the Greek of even Plato. It's called in history a New Testament Greek because the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation and the Epistle to the Hebrews is written in this kind of Greek. A Greek which is a poetic, jewel-like, syntactical, acrobatic Greek that one can hardly believe that anyone could talk this way. It's like really high magic talk, high Dharma talk. And in the first of the Hermetic dialogues, it's called the Poimandres. It's called the creative mind as a shepherd for learning. And Hermes Trismegistus says to his student, who is not just a student, but he says, I call you my son. Because on this level, we are all of this cosmic family. And I'm the father only as long as it takes you to learn as my son, and then you will become a father as well. And he says, in the Poimandres, we'll see, Hermes says to his son Tot, just like Socrates is saying to Phaedrus, we have come to a point to where we must allow real speaking, real talk to cascade over us, and it will be like a whirling waterfall cascade where both of us will be swept up. And we must have confidence that we're not going crazy and we're not going to our deaths, but we're going to a transform together. Because there's a mutuality in this. It's like the mutuality of lovers, only this is the mutuality of lovers of the poetic, of philosophic sparklingness, lovers of wisdom. And that out of this comes a new birth. It comes out of that. It's not just a rebirth of a body or a rebirth of the mind, but it's the birth of the spirit into its reality, from which there is no death. More next week.